Kurt Gerstein was a real SS officer, but the historical record doesn't support the premise that he was saved by Jewish prisoners. His actual story is different, and honestly more haunting. He joined the SS partly to gather evidence of what the Nazis were doing, witnessed mass murder at Belzec, and then spent the following years trying, and largely failing, to get the outside world to believe him and act. He died in French custody in 1945, under circumstances still debated by historians. I don't want to invent a false rescue narrative for a real person tied to real atrocities, so I'm going to tell his actual story, which is dramatic and tragic in its own right. Here it is. The SS officer who tried to stop the Holocaust from inside it. He stood in a train yard in occupied Poland in August 1942, wearing the black uniform of the SS, watching men who did not yet know they were about to die undressed in an open field. And he understood, with a clarity that would never leave him for the rest of his short life, that he was about to witness the exact crime he had joined this organization to document. Kurt Gerstein was not like the men around him. He had put on that uniform as a kind of infiltration, a desperate, half-formed plan to get close enough to the machinery of Nazi extermination to prove to the world it existed. What he saw that day in the forest camp of Belzec would follow him into every room he entered for the rest of his life, would drive him to try, again and again, to make people listen, and would ultimately contribute to a death so ambiguous that historians still argue, more than 75 years later, whether he was murdered, or whether the weight of what he had witnessed and failed to stop finally became too much for him to carry. This is the story of Kurt Gerstein, one of the strangest and most morally complicated figures to emerge from the machinery of the Holocaust. A man who wore the uniform of the SS while trying, in his own tangled and ultimately unsuccessful way, to bring that machinery's crimes into the light. Gerstein was born in 1905 in the German town of Münster, the son of a strict, conservative judge who raised his children within a rigid Protestant framework that emphasized discipline, order, and duty above almost everything else. He trained as a mining engineer, developed a genuine expertise in disinfection technology and public health engineering, and might have lived an entirely unremarkable technical career if history had not intervened. He was also a devout Christian, active in the Confessing Church, the wing of German Protestantism that resisted Nazi attempts to bring the church fully under state control. This resistance was not trivial. Gerstein was arrested multiple times in the 1930s for distributing anti-Nazi religious pamphlets, was expelled from the Nazi Party in 1936, and spent time in a concentration camp himself as a political prisoner, an experience that gave him a direct, visceral understanding of what the regime was capable of doing to people it decided were enemies of the state. It was this same period that would push Gerstein toward one of the most morally confounding decisions of his life. His sister-in-law, a young woman with a mental illness, was murdered in 1940 under the Nazi euthanasia program, the systematic killing of disabled and mentally ill Germans that served, in retrospect, as a grim rehearsal for the technology and bureaucratic methods that would later be turned against Jews across occupied Europe. Gerstein was devastated and enraged by her death, and in a decision that friends and family found almost impossible to understand at the time, he responded not by withdrawing further from the regime that had killed her, but by trying to get closer to it. He believed, with a conviction that seems almost naive in retrospect, that if he could get inside the system responsible for these killings, he could gather evidence, understand the mechanisms, and eventually expose them to the world in a way that would force them to stop. In 1941, Gerstein joined the SS. His technical expertise in disinfection and public health engineering made him valuable almost immediately, and he was assigned to the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS, where his official responsibilities included procuring and managing disinfection chemicals, including a compound called Zyklon B, originally developed and used as a pesticide. It was through this technical, seemingly bureaucratic role that Gerstein found himself, in the summer of 1942, ordered to deliver a large shipment of Zyklon B to the extermination camp at Belzec in occupied Poland, ostensibly for the stated purpose of disinfection, though Gerstein, given his position and the briefings he had received, understood by this point exactly what the chemical was actually being used for. What he witnessed at Belzec on August 19, 1942, became the defining trauma of his life, and later the defining piece of testimony he would spend the rest of the war trying, with escalating desperation, to get someone, anyone, in a position of power to believe. He watched thousands of Jewish men, women, and children arrive by train, watched them be told they were being taken for delousing and resettlement, watched them undress in an open yard under a hot August sun, watched them be driven, packed impossibly tight, into gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. He watched the diesel engine that was supposed to pump in the lethal exhaust fumes fail to start, listened to the screaming and praying of hundreds of people trapped inside a chamber that, due to mechanical failure, took nearly 3 hours instead of the intended 20 minutes to complete its purpose. He stood outside and heard all of it, and by his own later written account, he began praying alongside the people inside, though he was standing on the outside, wearing the uniform of the men who had put them there. Gerstein left Belzec that week carrying something almost no other SS officer of his rank and access ever attempted to carry out of the extermination camp system: a detailed, technically precise, first-hand account of exactly how the machinery of mass murder functioned, complete with numbers, procedures, and his own direct eyewitness testimony. He believed, with what now reads as a mixture of moral courage and dangerous naivety, that if he could get this account to the right people, to church leaders, to neutral diplomats, to anyone with international standing and a conscience, the killing could be stopped, or at minimum, the world could no longer claim ignorance of what was happening. What followed was a 2.5-year campaign of attempted disclosure that reads, in hindsight, as one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking failures of moral communication in the entire history of the Holocaust, not because Gerstein failed to try, but because almost every person he tried to tell either did not believe him, did not know what to do with the information, or was constrained by circumstances that made action functionally impossible. On a train shortly after leaving Belzec, Gerstein encountered a Swedish diplomat named Baron Göran von Otter, and in a conversation that stretched through the night in the train's corridor, he told von Otter everything: the trains, the chambers, the diesel engine, the screaming, the numbers of dead that already ran into the hundreds of thousands and were growing by the week. Von Otter, shaken by what he heard, wrote a detailed report and sent it to the Swedish Foreign Ministry, hoping it would be passed along to Allied governments. The report, by most historical accounts, either moved with agonizing bureaucratic slowness or was simply not acted upon with the urgency the information demanded, swallowed into the vast, indifferent machinery of wartime diplomacy, where a single junior diplomat's second-hand account, however detailed, however sincere, struggled to compete for attention against the overwhelming volume of wartime intelligence flowing through neutral capitals. Gerstein did not stop there. He approached representatives of the Catholic Church, including a papal nuncio in Berlin, hoping the moral authority of the Vatican could be marshaled to expose and condemn what was happening. He spoke with members of the Dutch resistance. He continued his work inside the SS Hygiene Institute, in what historians studying his case have suggested was a deliberate, dangerous strategy of remaining embedded within the system in order to continue gathering information, and, in some documented instances, to quietly sabotage or delay shipments of the very chemicals he was responsible for procuring, though the scale and consistency of this sabotage remains a subject of historical debate. difficult to verify given the secrecy under which he necessarily operated, and the destruction of much wartime documentation. The central, agonizing paradox of Gerstein's life is one that has occupied historians and ethicists for decades since. He remained, by his own choice, inside one of the most murderous organizations in human history for nearly 3 years after witnessing the full horror of its purpose, continuing to perform duties that included the procurement of the very chemical agent used to carry out mass murder. He was never, by the documentary record available today, a triggerman, never personally selected victims, never operated a gas chamber himself. But he wore the uniform, drew the salary, followed the orders that kept him positioned close enough to the machinery to continue, in his own account, trying to slow it and expose it. Whether this makes him a resistance figure operating undercover at extraordinary personal risk, a morally compromised bystander who told himself a comforting story about his own usefulness, or something uneasily suspended between the two, is a question that the historical record does not resolve cleanly, and honest historians have generally resisted resolving it cleanly on his behalf. What is not in dispute is that his warnings, distributed as widely as his access and courage allowed him to distribute them, largely failed to produce the urgent international response he had hoped for. The Allied governments, it later became clear, already possessed substantial intelligence about the mass murder underway in occupied Poland from multiple independent sources by 1942 and 1943, including reports from the Polish resistance and figures like Jan Karski, who had personally smuggled himself into the Warsaw Ghetto, and a transit camp to gather first-hand testimony he then carried to London and Washington. The tragedy of Gerstein's warnings was not that they were uniquely necessary and uniquely ignored, but that they joined a chorus of credible, detailed, horrifying testimony that Allied governments, for reasons involving bureaucratic caution, disbelief, competing wartime priorities, and in some documented cases, a troubling reluctance to make rescue of Jewish civilians a stated Allied war aim, largely failed to convert into any specific, targeted rescue action. As the war ground toward its end in the spring of 1945, Gerstein made a decision that, like so much of his life, defies simple categorization. Rather than attempting to flee or disappear as many SS officers did in the chaotic final weeks of the collapsing Reich, he voluntarily surrendered to French forces and immediately began writing. Over the following weeks, in French custody, he produced what became known as the Gerstein Report, an extraordinarily detailed, technically precise written account of the Belzec killings and the broader machinery of the final solution as he had witnessed and understood it from his position inside the SS hygiene apparatus. This document would later become one of the most important pieces of documentary evidence used at the Nuremberg trials, cited specifically for its technical precision regarding the mechanics of the gas chambers, information that came from almost no other single source with comparable detail and first-hand credibility. Gerstein never lived to testify at Nuremberg himself, and never lived to see how his report would be used. On July 25, 1945, he was found dead in his cell in the Church Midi prison in Paris, having apparently hanged himself with a strip of fabric, though the circumstances of his death remain, to this day, genuinely disputed among historians. Some believe the evidence supports suicide, a final collapse under the accumulated weight of everything he had witnessed and everything he had failed to stop, compounded by the crushing realization that despite surrendering voluntarily and cooperating fully, he was likely to be tried and possibly convicted as a war criminal by virtue of his SS membership, regardless of his documented attempts at internal resistance and external warning. Others have raised the possibility of murder, whether by fellow prisoners who viewed him as an SS traitor, or through some other means never fully investigated in the chaotic administrative conditions of post-war French military prisons. The truth, absent evidence that has never surfaced in the intervening decades, will likely never be definitively established. The post-war reckoning with Gerstein's legacy has been similarly unresolved. West German courts, reviewing his case in the years after the war, ultimately classified him as a resistor, a determination that allowed his family a measure of public rehabilitation, though the classification remained controversial among survivors and historians who noted, with justified unease, that a man's internal moral resistance, however sincere, existed alongside years of continued active service within an organization actively engaged in genocide. Playwrights and filmmakers have returned to his story repeatedly in the decades since, drawn to precisely the moral ambiguity that makes him so difficult to categorize. A man who cannot be comfortably filed away as either hero or villain, but who instead occupies a genuinely uncomfortable space that forces anyone examining his life to sit with difficult, unresolved questions about complicity, courage, and the excruciating limits of individual action within a totalitarian system, built explicitly to prevent exactly the kind of resistance he was attempting. What can be stated with confidence, based on the documentary record that survives him, is that Kurt Gerstein saw, with his own eyes, the precise machinery of mass murder at its most horrifically literal. The trains, the undressing, the chambers, the screaming, the diesel engine that failed and extended the agony of hundreds of trapped human beings by nearly 3 hours. He carried that knowledge for years, at obvious and severe personal risk, to Swedish diplomats, to Vatican representatives, to anyone he believed might act on it. His warnings, credible and detailed as they were, moved through the world too slowly, were believed too partially, and arrived at desks too disconnected from the levers of actual rescue, to save the millions who continued to be murdered in the years after his testimony began circulating. He died before he could explain himself fully to any tribunal, before he could see his own report entered into the permanent historical record at Nuremberg, before the world could decide, with the benefit of distance and documentation, what to make of a man who wore an executioner's uniform while trying, with limited and ultimately insufficient success, to stop the executions. His story endures not because it offers a clean, satisfying moral lesson, but precisely because it refuses to. It stands as a permanent, uncomfortable reminder that inside even the most totalizing and murderous systems human beings have built, individual conscience did not disappear entirely, but it also did not, by itself, prove capable of stopping the machine. Kurt Gerstein tried. The full weight of what he tried and what it failed to accomplish remains one of the most haunting, unresolved chapters of the entire history of the Holocaust. A story with no clean ending, only the documented fact of one man's testimony, preserved against the machinery he could not stop, standing today as evidence for a court, and a world that in the moment it mattered most, largely did not listen in time.